The Black Death is one of the deadliest events in human history. But behind the horror, the death, and the collapse lies a story that very few people know, a story not about disease, but about money. What if I told you that a plague, one that killed more than 50 million people, accidentally created the foundations of the modern world? What if the Black Death didn't just end the Middle Ages, but gave birth to capitalism, free labor, urban life, and the economic system we live in today? This is the hidden economy of the Black Death. The Black Death is one of the deadliest events in human history, but behind the horror, the death, and the collapse lies a story that very few people know. A story not about disease, but about money. What if I told you that a plague, one that killed more than 50 million people, accidentally created the foundations of the modern world? What if the Black Death didn't just end the Middle Ages, but gave birth to capitalism, free labor, urban life, and the economic system we live in today? This is the hidden economy of the Black Death. Europe in the 1340s was a rigid, hierarchical machine. Kings ruled at the top. The church shaped every part of life. And at the bottom, millions of peasants who had almost no freedom, tied to the land like property. Then, in 1347, a plague ship arrived in Sicily. Within months, entire towns disappeared, families vanished overnight, and the machine of medieval Europe began to break apart. The first system to collapse was the economy. Because the Black Death didn't just kill people, it killed workers, and without workers, nothing moved. Before the plague, there were too many peasants and not enough land. Landlords had all the power. Peasants worked for almost nothing. But after the Black Death, a shocking reversal. With half the population gone, suddenly every worker mattered. Fields were empty. Mills stopped turning. Harvests failed, simply because no one was alive to gather crops. And for the first time in their lives, peasants had leverage. If a landlord refused better pay, the worker simply walked away. Knowing another lord was desperate to hire him, panic spread through the noble class. Medieval Europe was turning into something completely new, a market where ordinary people could negotiate. Historical data shows something unprecedented. Real wages doubled. In some regions, they tripled. For a medieval peasant, this was a revolution. People bought better clothes, better food, better tools. Many moved to other towns seeking higher pay. Peasants, once trapped in a system of forced labor, were becoming free economic agents. The wealthy elite were furious, so governments passed emergency laws to freeze wages. In England, the Statute of Laborers made it illegal to ask for higher pay, but peasants ignored it. You can't legislate away a labor shortage. For centuries, Europe had been controlled by feudal lords, men who owned the land, the villages, and almost everyone living on it. But the Black Death destroyed their power. Landlords depended entirely on peasant labor. Without workers, their estates produced nothing. Taxes and rents collapsed. Many nobles went bankrupt. With fewer workers and more land available, peasants finally realized something. They no longer needed the lords, but the lords needed them. The entire feudal system, built on unfree labor, began to unravel. Some peasants even became landowners. A social earthquake was happening, and Europe would never be the same. As peasants gained freedom, many fled to the cities. There, wages were even higher. Workshops needed craftsmen. Merchants needed transporters. Shipyards needed builders. Cities exploded with economic activity. The Black Death unintentionally created a new class: urban workers with disposable income. These workers bought goods, which encouraged more production, which created more jobs, a cycle that looked very familiar. In fact, it looked like the early stages of capitalism. When so many people died, something surprising happened. Their property didn't vanish. It changed hands. A farmer who once owned nothing might suddenly inherit land from 4 relatives. For the first time, the poor became wealthy, and the wealthy lost power. This was one of the largest wealth redistributions in history. Nothing to do with governments or policies, but simply the brutal mathematics of mortality. This shift of wealth from elites to common people reshaped the entire economy, and it fueled the rise of the middle class. The Black Death also created something completely new: public health. Quarantine was invented. Hospitals transformed from religious shelters into medical institutions. Cities created health boards, the first in history. Record-keeping, death registries, and early statistics were born. The economy now needed healthy workers, and governments realized they had to protect them. A modern idea was emerging: the state was responsible for public well-being. With wealth shifting, wages rising, cities expanding, and institutions evolving, Europe entered a new era. Artists were funded by wealthy merchants, not just kings. Scientists explored ideas forbidden for centuries. Banks, credit systems, and accounting expanded. Without the economic shock of the Black Death, the Renaissance might never have happened. The plague destroyed the old world and cleared space for a new one. To understand the 21st century, we sometimes need to look at the 14th. When COVID-19 hit, we saw similar patterns: labor shortages, rising wages, remote work revolution, government intervention, new technologies accelerated by crisis. History shows that massive shocks don't just break systems, they rebuild them. The Black Death was Europe's greatest tragedy, but it was also its greatest turning point. The Black Death didn't just kill half of Europe, it killed feudalism, it killed the old economy, it killed the old world, and from its ashes rose something entirely new: a world where workers had power, a world of cities, markets, wages, and opportunity, a world that eventually became our world. Sometimes the future is born from catastrophe, and in the darkness of the 14th century, the foundations of modern society quietly took shape.